This YouTube video is to describe scientifically why opioids and heroin are so addictive. First, to answer that question, let's look at the reward pathway. The reward pathway is our very fundamental primordial pathway that exists so that our species survives. Behaviors in this pathway are not learned or taught. For example, when we experience hunger, we don't set off on an Easter egg hunt to try to figure out how to satisfy our hunger pains. We know that they're satisfied with food. When we have food, we get pleasure. Conversely, when we don't have food, we experience pain, and that is what reinforces the seeking of food and to get the pleasure. This pathway is primitive and fundamental to our species survival. We aren't taught to have a drive to indulge in behaviors in this pathway. For example, a hungry baby didn't have to be taught to cry in order to get food. A hungry baby cries for food because it's painful to be hungry, and then it receives the pleasure from the food. So it's a very heavily reinforced pathway. So let's see how this works on a scientific level from inside our bodies. So let's take the reward pathway and we look at the behaviors that are in the reward pathway: eating, drinking, having sex, and nurturing. Those are what are required for our species survival. So when we engage in these behaviors, we secrete our own endogenous opioids. These opioids will bind to our opioid receptors, and receptors are just molecules on the outside of cells that capture signals and transmit the message to the cell itself. So these fall into the receptors, activate the receptors, but we have enzymes that quickly degrade them so we don't get addicted to our own endogenous opioids. What heroin or exogenous opioids do is they hijack this pathway. It is a fluke of nature that our opioid receptors recognize a plant alkaloid like opium. And when these foreign opioids are introduced into the system, they bind to our receptors. They activate our receptors, but we don't have enzymes to degrade them. So they have to be metabolized, and that takes hours upon hours. Now our receptors and the system has had a magnitude and duration of activation that we could not provide it ourselves. So now the reward pathway for the person using opioids or heroin has opioids in the pathway. It actually dwarfs the other behaviors. In fact, you'll notice relationships suffer. They're not interested in sex, and eating and drinking only comes second to seeking out the opioid. The reward pathway is designed to be susceptible to drug abuse. Introduction of heroin or opioids into the reward pathway is one way, and it's irreversible because we were deliberately built without a mechanism to override the drive to indulge in the behaviors in this survival pathway. This is a heavily, doubly reinforced pathway. We get pleasure when we indulge in the behaviors, and we have pain when we don't. And it's not surprising that the magnitude of pleasure derived from opioids is matched with an equal and opposite magnitude of pain when opioids are withheld. We know that genetics plays a higher than 50% role in opioid addiction. Willpower is not part of the pathway if you are the person predisposed to opioid addiction. We are not designed to override the drive to indulge in these behaviors that are required for our species survival. Once opioids are in your reward pathway, they are there to stay, and they become the driving force of your character. This YouTube has been brought to you by the Hannah Dakota Fund and Truth Farm. You can visit us at www.truthfarmwest.org or www.hannahdakotafund.org. Thank you for watching.